Hi, everyone. Welcome to the ACS Materials Letters Global Web Seminar Series. And today is the second in the series and will be the last one for the 2020. So before we start, I would like to briefly introduce the ACS Materials Letter in a very short setting. The ACS Materials Letter is a flagship materials journal from the American Chemical Society. And we're dedicated to publishing the most transformative materials research with very fast processing time. And we love to publish multidisciplinary and innovative materials research addressing global challenges. And today we're delighted to have three wonderful speakers. The first one is Professor Jordan Bao from Stanford University. And she represents the editorial board member of ACS Materials Letters. And our second speaker is Wolfgang, and he represents our early career board members. And our third speaker is Jean-Luc. He's very special. He actually represents one of our authors who actually cannot make it, was a student. And he is the editorial board members of our sister journal, Chemistry Materials. So before we start, I would like to introduce Professor Jordan Bao. Jordan is the department chair and KK Lee professor of chemical engineering at Stanford University. Jordan is a very inspiring woman engineer who has won numerous awards and funded a lot of startups. He's also the founder of Stanford Wearable Electronic Initiative in 2016. She has over 500 publications and over 65 US patents with a Google Scholar Edge Index of 155. She is a member of the National Academy of Engineering and the National Academy of Inventors. She's globally known for her pioneering work on skin-inspired organic electronics. And today, she's going to share with us the most exciting work on the skin-inspired organic electronics. Jordan, please.
Hey, thanks, Bing. First, congratulations on the launching of the ACS Materials Letters. And it's a pleasure to speak here about our work. So let me share my slides. Okay, so today I'm going to tell you about the skin-inspired organic electronics work from my group. Okay. Next, okay. We believe stretchable sensors, circuits, and batteries are about to change our relationships with electronics and with each other. This is a comment that we put out in Nature magazine a few years ago. What we envisioned is that we're going beyond the smartphone era. Now we're starting to enter into the enhanced wearables era, and where we see that electronics are started to be worn on our clothes, and next will be on our skin, and eventually will be implanted inside our body. This is going to be how we're going to interface with the electronics around us and how we're going to interface with our environment and the friends. In our case, we use skin as the inspiration to think about how we can design such future electronics. Skin has the sensing functionality combined with signal processing, transmission, and the biointerface. All of these are features that we would like to incorporate into our future electronics. In addition to that, skin is also a wonderful material that combines flexibility, stretchability, biodegradability, and the self-healing all into one single material. There are a number of approaches towards stretchable electronics through development of new materials, also integration of inorganic materials with in between some stretchable interconnects, and also the functionalities for these materials and devices are increasingly improving. For example, sweat sensors that can sense various physiological parameters, as well as ion content and chemical content, and using the flexible form factor to get better signals and more accurate information. Over the past decade, my group has been developing such materials. Now we have a number of materials ranging from conductors to semiconductors, stretchable, self-healable, and even biodegradable. And all of them can have properties that are on par with those of amorphous silicon, and allowing us to start to make functional devices that are of great interest for different applications. This is this video here shows what these devices looks like, and you can see we can bend and twist them. The red curve shows the output curve of the electrical current, and the black line is the leakage current. As you can see, even when the device is being poked by a sharp object, the current output is hardly changing, indicating that these skin-like materials can enable very, very robust materials and devices. With the development of the fabrication methods, now we have a number of materials that are available to build circuits and the basic circuit blocks. And here we can have the most basic digital circuit and the analog circuit building blocks that are all fabricated using intrinsically stretchable transistor arrays. We're able to build not only just hundreds of transistors, but rather thousands of transistors. This is a tactile e-skin that has 10 by 10 arrays of transistor plus 10 by 10 tactile sensors that can be used to sense the location of this ladybug leg and give the image of where the legs are located. One of the advantages of having such stretchable circuits and transistors is that when we build sensors, the sensor output could be potentially maintained to be only sensitive to the external stimuli without being affected by the strain or movement. For example, for stretchable temperature sensor, many of those reported are using resistive sensing, which is both sensitive to temperature as well as to strain or bending or pressure. So in our case, we designed these circuits made of transistors where there is a reference transistor that's incorporated so that the effect from strain or bending or pressure can be subtracted using the simple circuit, so that the circuit output will only be sensitive to temperature and without being sensitive to strain. So on the right in this figure in the plot, you can see when we vary different strain and the voltage output as a function of temperature is not dependent on the strain at all. So ultimately, when we build wearable electronic systems, the part that's most desirable to be in contact with skin is the sensing part, while the data processing part will still currently be made of microprocessors, which is rigid components. In addition to that, we also need a battery for power, providing the power. So these rigid components will make the wearable system to become rather bulky, and we will not be able to take advantage of the form factor of our stretchable electronics that we can develop. So the concept that we are taking advantage of is similar to those of RFID tag concept. This is what we call the body net. In the body net system, we have the sensor together with the antenna made with entirely stretchable material. And in the future, simple circuit blocks such as amplifiers and ring oscillators can also be built onto these sensing tags to make the sensing tag even more accurate. But the rigid component, as shown here, that contains Bluetooth, battery, and microprocessors can be put onto the reader, and the reader is placed onto the clothing of the person where there's room for such more rigid components, but the reader is placed in close proximity to the sensors so that the information of the sensor can be read by these readers and then sent through the Bluetooth to the central cloud. And in this case, we're able to separate the stretchable component from the rigid component and fully take advantage of the stretchable form factor of our sensors. This demonstration here shows where the user wearing multiple sensors on the arm, on the belly, and on the legs, as well as on the hand, to monitor several different parameters all at the same time, where the readers are all placed onto the clothing. So that in this case, the sensors are basically the form of stickers that can stick anywhere on the body and without imposing any uncomfortableness. And this allows us to be able to sense information more than what a Fitbit can sense, which is just the movement of the person by measuring the number of steps. But here we can measure the details of the movement of each leg or each hand and the breathing frequency, as well as the heart rate. Of course, in the future, many other sensors can be incorporated into this platform. The body net structure can be designed to be very thin and very small. So here shows a small body net that measures pressure that can be placed onto the wrist to sense the pulse wave, or multiple such sensors can be placed onto one single sheet. And each sensor can be designed to have a different resonance frequency. And then this way we will be able to read out the sensor response simultaneously using the reader reading different frequencies. The body net can also be implanted inside the body. In this case, we wrap around this pressure sensor around the artery, and the antenna is being placed under the skin. So this way, the reader can read through the skin, even though there is some signal attenuation by the tissue, but under the skin, still it's possible to read out the signal through the skin. And here we show that it's possible to monitor the blood vessel, whether the blood vessel is clogged using this kind of wireless implantable sensor. Here, the demonstration shows when the artery is blocked, then you can see the signal decrease significantly, while when it's unclogged, then we can detect the pulse from the blood flow again. And this is designed to be also a biodegradable sensor, so that after the initial monitoring, the sensor can degrade over time without having another surgery. Next, I would like to talk about the biointerface aspect after the above quick overview of the status of the skin-inspired electronics in general. The examples I want to give here are some examples where we see the skin-like form factor can play a unique role that conventional rigid electronics are not going to be able to realize. So for implantable electronics, there are a number of potential mismatches between conventional rigid electronics and the soft tissue. One is the modulus mismatch and the bending stiffness of the rigid electronics. Certainly, rigid electronics can be potentially reduced in thickness and make them to have lower bending stiffness. However, the high modulus, especially at the edges of such electronics, can potentially still cause damage to the tissue because of the movement of tissue over time. The areas we see in particular, the skin-inspired electronics can play really unique roles are areas where the dynamic movement or changing in size in the tissue may be involved for the particular application. For example, this is one of the highest conductivity stretchable PDOT that we have reported previously. In this case, the addition of ionic liquid that contains Ni that also serves as a dopant for the conducting polymer can change the morphology of the original film before the addition of this ionic species. In the original film, the conducting part is stabilized by the PSS and forms these kinds of nodule-like morphology where the conducting polymer is not interconnected. But with the addition of the ionic liquid, we induce aggregation of the conducting polymer that's being seen as the nanofibers that's shown here and in the AFM. And at the same time, the ionic liquid can dope the conducting polymer to increase the conductivity, as well as plasticizing the PSS component so that the entire polymer becomes highly stretchable. The conductivity of such a film can reach as high as 4,000 Siemens per centimeter at 100% strain. This is among the highest conductivity value, even for non-stretchable conducting polymer. But in this case, it's achieved for 100% strain. So it's a very remarkable value. Using this kind of ionic liquid, stable kind of modified hydrogel, then we are able to increase the connectivity between the p-dot component. So the student in the group came up with a modified method to taking advantage of this hydrogel and being able to make it into a biocompatible hydrogel. So the ionic liquid, since it's not biocompatible, it's first used to induce the high conductivity, and then the ionic liquid is removed and the film is dried, but the p-dot network is being formed because of the ionic liquid. And then after the film is dried, this film can undergo any patterning, lithography and etching using traditional patterning method. And then this material, after patterning, can again be exposed to water and allow the material to get rehydrated. And here from this video, you can see the side view of the film after hydration. It will increase thickness by 6 times, and then this great increase in the absorption of water result in a conducting hydrogel that has tissue-like modulus on the order of a few tenths of kilopascal, but at the same time the conductivity remains high because the conducting component is still interconnected. The advantage of this kind of electrode is that when we use that for stimulating nerves, for example, here we are stimulating the sciatic nerve of a mouse to obtain the same leg movement using this kind of conducting polymer hydrogel. We can use basically around 50 millivolts is sufficient because it puts out a very high current even at low voltage. But if we use a metal, conventional metal electrode, we needed to use 10 times higher voltage in order to obtain the same amount of leg movement. So the lower the voltage, the least likely for damaging of the tissue, and as a result, can give a more biocompatible implant for nerve stimulation. The next example I want to show is to address a challenge that cannot be solved using currently available device form factor. For infants to children, adolescents, and finally adults, our body size and organ grow and increase in size dramatically. Existing implantable bioelectronics do not accommodate such developmental tissue growth. For example, a vagus nerve stimulator was implanted when the patient was young. After years of constraint, the nerve is severely compressed. Some young patients has to go through multiple invasive correction surgery during their lifetime to replace such rigid device. A new type of implantable electronics, for which we give its name Morphine Electronics or Morph-E, that grows with expanding tissue or organ without causing any mechanical constraints. Other than the electronics requirements, we will want our implantable to assert almost no force, that is no constraint at all, when the material is under extremely slow strain rate, similar to the case of tissue growth rate. On the other hand, the electronics needs to stay tightly wrapped around the organ despite any body movement. Therefore, under a faster strain rate, the material should behave elastically. As seen in this photo and the plot, the length of the electronics would not shrink even days or months after strain is removed. Their stress strain curve are shown on the left and indeed represent the behavior of what we hope to achieve. The morphine was implanted into adolescent rat for up to 8 weeks. During this time, the diameter of the nerve where the implant was made is at least doubled. As can be seen from the left side, after wrapping the stimulator around the nerve with gentle pressing, the stimulator immediately forms a good tight contact with the nerve. After implanted for 4 weeks, we can see that the morphine electronics stays in good conformal tight contact with the nerve. On the contrary, the standard nerve cuff currently used in clinic is made with rigid plastic. Even though it has an opening to accommodate some degree of change in size, it could not stay in place due to the growth of the nerve and caused severe damage to the nerve. One of the questions we have been asking ourselves when we started working with e-skin is, how do we connect the sensor outputs with specific sensory nerves? How do we specifically control the stimulation of particular motor nerves to control muscle movement? On the other hand, the high level of structural and functional complexities in multicellular living systems remains beyond the reach of human design and assembly capabilities. If we're able to mimic the capabilities of cells in living organisms to recruit specific chemical building blocks to construct synthetic materials in vivo, and even to assemble complex functional structures in vivo, it will open up many new possibilities to truly merge electronics with living organisms for treatment of chronic diseases. Genetic targeting offers a way to specifically target certain cell types. For example, optogenetics, pioneered by my colleague Karl Desroff, allows specific targeting of specific neurons in the brain so that they become sensitive to light stimulation. Using genetic targeting, specific cell type can be functionalized with an oxidative enzyme, so-called APEX2 here. In presence of aniline dimer and the monomer and a dilute hydrogen peroxide solution, oxidative polymerization of aniline is triggered, and the deposition of polyaniline occurs on APEX2-coded neurons. It can be seen from the right side. The control cells without APEX2 did not have any polyaniline deposition under similar chemical conditions, while the cells targeted with APEX2 showed clear polyaniline deposition. Interestingly, the neuron cells coated with conducting polyaniline showed decreased the firing rate, while when they are coated with an insulating polymer, PDAP, the firing rate increased. This suggests that we may be able to selectively stimulate specific type of neurons. In summary, here I've talked about some examples of our skin-inspired electronics, and in particular, the unique applications such electronics can enable. And we see a bright future of using skin-inspired materials and sensors for the future generation of implantable and wearable. Finally, I'd like to thank my research group, the students and postdocs, for their creative and hard work that took us from the initial exploration to where we are currently. And I very much look forward to where we can go from here in the future. I thank the funding agencies for their support and many collaborators for the collaboration and inspirations over the years. And thank you for listening.
Okay, thanks very much. Going to end the show and stop sharing and answer any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Zhenan, for a very inspiring talk. And then we already have like several questions lining up in Q&A section. So every attendee, so if you have any questions, please input into this Q&A section and input early. So I will pick up like some rows most interesting to ask the speaker. All right, so let me start with the first question to Zhenan. So this is from Titash, Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. So his question is, he's wondering what is the impact of moisture or sweat, especially in a tropical region, on the performance of these kind of sensors?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. Definitely for most of the materials, there may be response of the electronic characteristics towards moisture or sweat. So the devices indeed will need to have some level of encapsulation. For the materials, for the hydrophobic conjugated polymers, we previously found that by designing the side chains to have dense packing, then these materials can potentially even operate in aqueous condition continuously for a long time. But still, the electrical characteristic fluctuation could pose a problem. So encapsulation and also the strategy of designing circuit, for example, we used that strategy for temperature sensor, where in the design we have regions of the device is responding to temperature, but then other region of the device respond to the strain, so that the circuit can be designed that the undesirable impact, such as here would be moisture, in that case was the strain can be canceled out. And also, yeah, I was looking at the second question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Zhenan. So the second question from this list is for skin-inspired sensor. So what type of polymer materials were used to get a kind of a very fast self-healing performance? And then what's kind of the best mechanism for the self-healing? And then is there any kind of surfactant used in these kind of devices? And is there any kind of impact on irritation in skin?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the rate of self-healing depends very much on the dynamics of the polymer, as well as the number of units that are available to participate in self-healing. So, and also the two parameters can conflict with each other, because if you incorporate too many self-healing bonds, usually these bonds are used for cross-linking the polymer network. Then if you add too many of that, the cross-linking density is high, and then the dynamic of the polymer will be lower, than the self-healing would be slower. But that's the general rule of thumb. There are a lot of room to design the specific, for example, polymer backbone structure, as well as the actual dynamic bonds that have been used. And people have realized the fast healing, even with polymer that's like a rigid, even as rigid as a brittle plastic, has a gigapascal modulus, but still able to self-heal very quickly. But in general, the two parameters, the dynamics of polymer and the the number of bonds, and also I should say the breakage of the bonds is important, because you have to make the units, self-healing unit, reactive group available to participate in new reaction.
Okay, thank you, Zhenan. So I think maybe just one last question. So we have like more and more questions coming in, so we cannot pick all due to the time limits. So the last question, I think it's very relevant in terms of our integration. So this is from Xiaolin Guo. So she's interested in the application of flexible electronics in general. And so her question, I think, is the most accurate needs for the technology to be more practically useful. And then any thoughts on integration of these flexible battery, whether it's necessary, and what will be like a core issue to overcome in terms of powering these sensor devices.
Yeah, in the near term, we have already seen flexible electronics on the market. For example, now there are flexible foldable phones, smartphones by Samsung and by Royal from China, and many other companies as well now. So that's a direct application of flexible electronics. And in the wearable space, there are many possibilities for wearable patches that are flexible. And in that case, flexible battery will be very, very important. And currently, many of the wearable patches are bulky, still quite bulky, because the battery is the coin cell battery and quite rigid. And even though there are some flexible batteries on the market, they are not really flexible. If you bend them, they tend to fail quite readily. So there's certainly a great need for flexible batteries.
Okay, all right. So due to the time limits, let's thank our first speaker, Professor Zhenan Bao, once more. Thank you so much, Zhenan. Thank you. All right. Okay, so let me start to introduce our second speaker. So our second speaker is Professor Wolfgang Zehr. So he received a doctorate degree in inorganic chemistry in 2013 from the Johannes Gutenberg University Mainz, so under the supervision of Professor Wolfgang Trammell and Professor Jeff Snyder. And he then went on to do his postdocs at University of Southern California, Caltech, Northwestern University, and then he joined as junior group leader at the Liebig University Gießen, and very recently, so Professor Zehr started to hold professorship for inorganic chemistry at the University of Münster. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Professor Zehr, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and it's really a pleasure to show some of our work here. And I've decided to talk about a question that has been following me and my group for the past 2 or 3 years, whether there are inductive effects in solid ionic conductors. And so the question pretty much is, why do we even need solid ionic conductors? Well, I think a general thrust these days when it comes to batteries is the idea that we can move away from a lithium-ion battery to a solid-state battery, where we sort of replace the liquid electrolyte with a fast ion conducting solid. And the idea behind this is that ideally we get to higher energy densities, faster charge rates, things like that, especially if we use a lithium metal anode. And whereas the change from a lithium-ion battery to a solid-state battery needs a lot of changes in processing, we need percolation, we need electrolyte stability, we still need really good ionic conductors. These days we're in the order of magnitude between 1 and 10 millisiemens mostly, but we need to push ionic conductivities further. And to sort of show how difficult and promising this is a plot of data mined ionic conductivities versus a bunch of different classes of materials. And for instance, in this class of materials, the iridites, you can see that the conductivities, they change between orders of magnitudes. Even activation barriers, or the energy that we need to make an ion jump, changes quite a lot. And so the question really is, can we understand this, and can we then use guided designs to push the ionic conductivity? And to get us all up to speed, what is an ionic conductivity of a material in general? So we have a lithium ion, in this case, sitting on a specific lattice site that needs to jump to an adjacent lattice site. By doing that, it needs to displace the lattice a little bit. This costs energy. This is our associated delta G. And this displacement of the lattice, afterwards, the ion jumps to its final state. And so there's a lot of structural parameters that influence the activation barrier, the energy landscape of these materials. We need a high number of available sites. I mean, if there's a lithium already sitting here, the lithium can't jump there. We need a certain dimensionality. We ideally need 3-dimensional conductors over 1-dimensional conductors, because real materials have defects and we can have blocking effects. Usually in terms of structures, we discuss certain polyhedral connectivities, whereas phase-sharing polyhedra are better. And there's a question of how much does your coordination environment change? Here in this case, from a 3-fold to a 4-fold coordination, is this beneficial for the ion or not? All of this influences the energy landscape. And one of the typical approaches to affect ionic conductivity is to increase the width of the diffusion pathway. So if this bottleneck that I just showed is intrinsically larger, it may cost a lot less energy for this jump to overcome. And so what we usually do in ionics is we try to blow up the unit cell via substitution. And schematically, this is shown here that by a wider cell, we should have a lower activation barrier and higher conductivity. But then there's also questions like polarizability of the anions, and especially how do bonding interactions change within materials. And this is something I want to talk about today. But let's focus on this idea that if we increase the unit cell size, the conductivity should change. And so a material that we've been working on for a while is the LGPS phase, lithium tane germanium P2S12. It's a thiophosphate. We have germanium and phosphorus sharing a specific site here that sort of form these chains with a lithium position. And these chains are bridged by a PS4 orthothiophosphate unit. And this is one of the fastest ionic conductors in lithium that we know in the solid state, because if you look down the z-axis, you have these beautiful tunnels of lithium 1, lithium 3 that can just shoot through the unit cell. It makes it a really fast ionic conductor. In reality, what we found early on using maximum entropy methods of neutron diffraction data is that it's actually 3-dimensional conductor. So you can see these, the red means high lithium concentration. You can see these strings of lithium going in the z direction, but you also have a little bit of diffusion in the xy plane. And so in general, this is technically a 3-dimensional conductor, but recent work from a Kano group showed via single crystals that the tunnels are dominating in transport. So really this diffusion here from a lithium 1 via lithium 3, lithium 1 is sort of the major diffusion pathway in the material. And a few years ago, we tried to figure out if changing the unit cell volume of these materials gives us a higher conductivity, because this is sort of the paradigm that we always use in the ionics community. And so by doing isoelectronic substitutions of germanium with tin, we can see that if we just look at this tetrahedron where germanium and tin are sitting, we see an expansion on the side. So tin is really going on this germanium side. The PS4 side stays the same, so we're not substituting there. So it's just one position in the unit cell where we're changing things. How does that influence the transport? Well, we're pulling the unit cell apart, and the conductivity here from right to left, so from left to right, so with increasing tin content, decreases. And the activation barrier increases. And this is counter to everything that I just told you, that usually larger unit cells should give us a lower activation barrier. And so we really tried to come up with an explanation why this would be the case. And one idea was that there could be an inductive effect involved, with the idea that if we change from germanium to tin as the central element in these polyhedra, that the bonding interaction would change. So germanium, the electronegativities are shown down here. Germanium is more electronegative, more electron pulling, should pull charge density away from the sulfur. Whereas tin, less electronegative, should have longer bonds anyways because it's larger, and because it's less electron pulling, we should have more electron density sitting here on the sulfur. More electron density should then mean, in terms of Coulombic attraction, that we have a much stronger Coulombic attraction if we have tin in the system than if we have germanium in the system. And the stronger attraction should mean that ideally that we need more energy to sort of break that ionic bond and have an ionic jump. But the question is this really the case? I mean, seems like an intuitive hypothesis, but I don't know if it's just too good to be true. And so over the last few years, together with Ben Morgan and his student Alex at the University of Bath, we really tried to prove or at least disprove this hypothesis. And so the approach that we chose was to measure the bond strength, the local bond strength and average bond strength along the series, calculate these bonding interactions, and see if we can actually find an experimental evidence that the lithium substructure is changing. All right, what did we do? The first thing you can do, you can just collect Raman spectra, and these Raman spectra will give you A1s or symmetric stretching modes of your polyhedra. If you know the Raman shift, you can calculate a force constant out of this by a reduced mass, and since the center of this tetrahedron is not changing, it's really just the sulfur is the reduced mass. So if you weigh this via the contributions that we have in there, on the left germanium, on the right tin, we see that the force constant of this tetrahedron decreases. So this chemical idea that the bond becomes weaker if we move from germanium to tin seems to be the case, at least based on the Raman data. We can also measure Debye frequencies, which are sort of an average metric of how stiff and how strong bonding interactions are in the whole solid, and they also decrease. So overall, it seems like if we put tin into the system, the bond strength of this metal-sulfur bond and the whole structure decreases. What do we see in calculations? Well, it's a tricky question because it really depends on how to calculate these. And it took us a while to figure out how to properly assess these bonding changes. And so what Ben and a student did was calculating COHPs, so bonding overlap influences. And what we see is that the germanium sulfur bond is more negative than the tin sulfur bond, which suggests a stronger covalent bond for germanium sulfur. If we calculate net atomic charges, we see that the sulfur that is bonded to the tin has a much lower negative or higher negative charge density. And we also see that there's a different bond polarity. So the germanium sulfur bond is a lot less polar than the tin sulfur bond. So this falls all in place with the idea that we should, if you look over here, we should have more electron density on the sulfur. If we're in tin, the bond is weaker, and this ideally has a higher charge density, as I said. But do we really see changes in the structure? Well, I'm only going to show you lithium 1, lithium 3 because these are the major diffusion tunnels here. And so in a different representation, lithium 1 close to, in this case, the sulfur 2, this is the crystallographically closest sulfur that we have, and the lithium 3, this is a little bit of a shorter distance. And so we took temperature-dependent neutron data, refined and looked at the different distances that we get. The error bars are averages over a temperature, over all of the temperature data, to get an idea how reliable these changes are. What we see is in blue that the distance of the sulfur 2 and the lithium 1 doesn't change much from germanium to tin. The bond distance that changes is this one here, of the lithium 3 that is closer in distance to the sulfur 2. This bond distance decreases from germanium to tin, meaning that the more tin we have in there, the higher the charge density on the sulfur, the closer this lithium sulfur distance becomes. And concurrently, we also see changes in the occupancies. What we see if we go from germanium to tin, the lithium 1 occupancy decreases and the lithium 3 occupancy increases. So it's not just the distance that changes, but the more charge density there is here, lithium gets pulled from lithium 1 to the closer distance lithium 3, and then the bond distance also changes, so it becomes just closer in bonding. So it seems that these subtle changes, electronic changes, reshuffle the lithium in this diffusion pathway. And lithium seems to be really pulled towards the tin S4 polyhedra. Now we can find a few correlations here. We can then plot our sulfur 2 lithium 3 distance against the force constant that we can measure, and at the lower force constant, so the weaker tin sulfur bond, we also find the shortest distance because of the higher electron charge density on the sulfur and the higher occupancy. How does the transport change? Well, we can plot our measured activation barriers versus this distance. And this sort of shows us that the longer the distance is, the weaker the bond, the less energy we need to put into the system to make the ion jump from one side to the next one. But these are really just correlations. Is there really a causal change? So something that Ben did, which I really like, is the idea of let's look at how much energy it takes to remove a lithium. Does the lithium-sulfur attraction really change? And we can calculate bond polarities and things like that, but does this sulfur-lithium attraction really change? And so he built a supercell of this LGPS, or the germanium phase, and put one single tin atom in there. And then calculated the vacancy formation energy, so the energy it takes to take a lithium out. And naively, one would say, okay, the more energy it takes to take it out, the more stronger it is bounded. And now we used a cutoff of 3 angstroms, looking at all of the lithium that is further away than 3 angstroms from that tin site, and all of the lithium that is closer than 3 angstroms away from this till sulfur polyhedron. In orange is everything that is closer to this tin site, and the lithium that are closer to the tin site have a higher formation energy. So it really seems like the lithium is stronger bounded to the tin S4 tetrahedron than to the germanium tetrahedron. Does it really affect the potential energy landscape? Well, one sort of needs to deconvolute electronic and structural effects here, because clearly the structure is also changing. And so what we did was we looked at notch-elastic band calculations of pathway potential landscapes of lithium when germanium is in the germanium phase and when tin is in the tin phase. And here, tin has the higher activation barrier. This is what we see in ionic transport in the measurements as well. Now we decide to keep the structure fixed and swap germanium with tin. So now germanium is in the tin structure in blue and tin is in the germanium structure in orange. And even though these are the unrelaxed structures of the initial starting materials, tin again has a higher activation barrier. And so I think this does show that switching germanium for tin leads to the higher activation barriers due to the changes in this electronic charge density, and the idea of this change of electronegativity seems to really do the trick. So it seems like we can decouple structural and electronic differences and electronic effects. The idea of an inductive effect seems to be the case, but the question is this just the case here? Is this just a coincidence in these materials that have this dominant one-dimensional tunnel diffusion, or is this some sort of general influence? And these are still questions that we want to answer, and I hope I was able to convince you that it's fun to work with these ionic conductors. There's more to it than just electronic effects, than just structural effects. And of course, I need to thank Ben Morgan here for the work from his group, my whole group, and the funding. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions you may have.
Right. Thank you, Wolfgang. So our plan is to have like the final questions for our final 2 talks, like right after the third one. Right? Can you help remain with us for additional 15?
Of course.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so let's move on to our third talk today. So by Professor Jean-Loup Bredes. So Dr. Bredes is a professor of chemistry and biochemistry at the University of Arizona. So he received a PhD from University of Namur, Belgium in 1979, and he's elected member of International Academy of Quantum Molecular Science and also Royal Academy of Belgium and the European Academy of Sciences. And he received many recognitions, including most recently a 2016 ACS Award in the Chemistry of Materials, and the 2019 Alexander von Hobel Research Award, and also this year MRS Material Theory Award. So he actually has served as the editor with Chemistry of Materials, our sister journal, since 2008. So the floor is yours, Professor Bredes.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. And I'd like to thank you and Ben for having selected our paper for this webinar. And let me get this here. Okay, so this is actually work that has been done by a very talented postdoc of mine, Dr. Hadi Abroshan, who cannot give the presentation himself because good for him. He just joined the Schrödinger software company a couple of weeks ago as a senior scientist. So the talk has to do with the theoretical characterization of the emission in purely organic materials based on a phenomenon that's referred to as hyperfluorescence. And to put the work in context, it's useful to go back to the different generations of purely organic materials that have been used for light emission as materials that can be the active components of organic light emitting diodes, of OLEDs. The first generation was actually made of purely fluorescent systems, such as in the case of pi-conjugated polymers, polyphenylene vinylene, which was discovered as being electroluminescent by the groups of Richard Friend and Andy Holmes at Cambridge back in the late 1980s. And this gives us also the most simple architecture in the case of an OLED. You have, of course, a transparent substrate, a transparent anode, in most instances indium tin oxide, a thin layer of the emitter, in this case PPV, and then a low work function cathode. And when you apply an electric field across the device, electrons get injected from the cathode, holes get injected from the anode, and when a hole captures an electron, they form an excited state on a polymer chain, they form an exciton, which we hope will radiatively decay back to the ground state, that is, will emit a photon. But immediately we get to the singlet-triplet conundrum, which is the fact that since there is no correlation between the spins of the injected holes and electrons, when a hole meets an electron, they form a singlet exciton only 1/4 of the time, and 3/4 of the time they form a triplet, which in these fluorescent materials is a dark state, which doesn't emit and decays non-radiatively to the ground state. And this is the reason why one wants to go away from those fluorescent materials, since when spin statistics is followed, 3/4 of the input electrical power is lost right off the bat. And so in the late 1990s, Mark Baldo, Mark Thompson, and Steve Forrest designed the second generation of organic emitters, in which actually these are based on coordination complexes that have heavy metal atoms at their centers. And so in those coordination complexes, because of spin-orbit coupling with the heavy transition metal atom wave functions, the transition from the triplet states down to the singlet ground state becomes allowed. And in those instances, 100% of excitons can possibly decay radiatively, and that's actually been demonstrated to be the case. And these are the materials actually, such as those iridium complexes here. These are the materials that are used in the commercial OLEDs, a field that already corresponds to a market of about $80 billion a year. But there is a desire to go back to purely organic materials to get rid of those heavy metal atoms. And so in 2012, Chihaya Hadachi and his coworkers at Kyushu University in Japan designed the third generation of OLED materials that's based on a phenomenon referred to as thermally assisted delayed fluorescence. That's a phenomenon that's already known, has been described since 1929 by Perrin in France. And the idea here is to design organic molecules that have a triplet state, a lowest triplet state, very close in energy to the lowest singlet state, within 0.2 eV or less. In that instance, during their lifetimes, the triplet exciton, through thermal excitation, can do a reverse intersystem crossing, go to the singlet manifold and produce a delayed fluorescence signal. And such emitters actually now also can provide for 100% quantum internal efficiency, that is, for every electron that's injected into the active layer, 1 photon is emitted. But TADF molecules used as emitters have some disadvantages. For instance, because those molecules are designed in such a way as to having a donor component, electron donor component, and an electron acceptor component, their transition from the lower singlet state back to the singlet ground state as a charge transfer character, which leads to a broad emission and low color purity with respect to what can happen in purely fluorescent emitters, such as this rubrine derivative that has a much sharper emission. Also, in many instances, the rate of radiative decay is actually slower than the rate of forward intersystem crossing, which recycles triplets. And so we get long-lived triplet excitons, which can lead to degradation processes and decrease the efficiency. And that's the reason why Chihaya Adachi then proposed the 3.5 generation of OLED materials based on hyperfluorescence. And the idea here is to have an active layer, an emissive layer that has 3 components: a host matrix, TADF molecules that are now used as sensitizers, and then fluorescent emitters into which we want to funnel all of the excited states, fluorescent emitters that have a narrow emission band, so high color purity and very fast decay. And if we look at the electronic state diagram, on the one hand, we have the TADF sensitizers, on the other hand, the fluorescent emitters. We want to maximize the rate of energy transfer from the singlet excitons on the sensitizers to the singlet states of the fluorescent emitter, but then we want also to prevent the Dexter energy transfer from triplet to triplet, because here those triplets would be wasted. And that's where we get back to Hadi's paper, who first considered through a combination of molecular dynamics simulations and long-range corrected density functional theory calculations, a number of fluorescent emitters that are generally used in hyperfluorescence applications. And as you can see, these are systems that have a fused ring systems, such as rubrine or the rubrine derivative already mentioned earlier. And one first thing that Hadi found out is that in those typical fluorescent emitters, when looking at the distribution energy of the triplet state and the singlet state in the emissive layer, he found out that the lowest triplet is very low in energy with respect to the lowest singlets. And that's the case across the 6 fluorescent emitters that he investigated. And so what it means is that when we go back to the energy state diagrams with the TADF sensitizers to the right, the fluorescent emitters to the left, the Dexter energy, which we want to prevent, the Dexter energy transfer from the lowest triplet of the sensitizer to the lowest triplet of the emitter will be negligible, because we are actually, because of that large difference in energy, we are in a Marcus inverted regime. But there is still the possibility of Dexter energy transfer to upper lying triplet excited states on the emitter. And so how can we get rid also of those other energy transfers? And that's the proposed strategy that comes out of Hadi's paper, which is the fact that actually what would be really interesting would be to be able to design fluorescent emitters in which the second triplet excited state is very much higher in energy with respect to the lower singlet excited state, which means that then the Dexter energy transfer would be too much uphill and would be negligible as well. So ideally, what we need to do is to try to design fluorescent emitters that have both a large S1 to T1 gap, as well as a large T2 to S1 gap. And so that's the main message of that paper, which was published a couple of months ago in ACS Materials Letters. And with that, I'd like again to thank the ACS Materials Letters team for having selected Hadi's paper for this presentation, and all of you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Brides. So yeah, and we also want to thank you for sending this very nice work to our relatively new journal. Thank you. So I think let's start with the questions. And I see Professor Zaire already helped answer some questions posted in the Q&A. So I think, yeah, no problem. So let's actually look into, and then if you have more questions for Professor Brides, so please provide input to Q&A, so we can have a couple more minutes to answer your questions. All right, so let me read one of the questions for Professor Zaire again. So I have one, this is from Jelena Bizjelic. So question is the preparation of these materials, which you generally, which things is kind of approach do you use in this, probably is talking about your recent JAX paper, right? Yeah.
So that material usually is done initially by ball milling and then annealing it at elevated temperatures. All of these diophosphates, it's either ball milling, direct solid state synthesis. Some of them can be prepared via liquid synthesis. It really depends on the material. But in this case, it was ball milling the precursors and then annealing it.
Okay. Thank you, Wolfgang. So, and we have three more questions coming up for Professor Brides. So one of the first question is, thank you, Dr. Brides, for the presentation. I'm curious of how these highly conjugate organic molecules could be processed due to their limited solubility, and especially given your design for these OLED to suppress this Dexter energy loss. So generally, probably these very general questions for the field, yeah.
So, I mean, there are two components here. I mean, one is the fact that there's still a number of active layers and devices that are made based on evaporation. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, as the fact that we have a rigid fused ring backbone, still there are side chains that allow for solubility as well. So for solution processing, indeed, you can get those systems to be assembled together. And these are, I mean, the matrix is also a pi conjugated system like biphenyl carbazolyl derivative, so that there is good affinity between the different components of the matrix.
Okay, thank you. Another question is from Piero Silva. So isn't the Dexter energy transfer prevented by dispersing these emitters in the matrix?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Piotr, that's for sure. That's one way that you are trying already to limit the Dexter transfer. That is by having the fluorescent emitter at just 1 weight%, for instance, in the active matrix, with respect to the sensitizer that's at 20 weight%, generally speaking. Still, what Hadi has found is that there is still a non-negligible Dexter component to the energy transfer. And so this is a next step to prevent that type of transfer, which would be to try to push up the T2 state energy, which brings us to the next question, which was, well, I mean, what kind of systems can have a higher T2? And that's exactly what we are trying to find out. This is not obvious, because if you go back to a number of earlier calculations, for instance, that have been reported in JAX in 2005 or 6 by the group of Mark Wagner, there was the impression at the time, using the functionals that could be used at the time, that indeed there are some systems that have a pretty high T2 state with respect to T1. It turns out that that's unfortunately not really the case. And so the jury is still out there in terms of trying to design molecules that could have a very high T2.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Professor Brides. So the last question is from Ramanathan. So very nice talk, Professor Brides. The calculation you have done for these conjugated polymer reveal very important information about S1 and T1 separation. So so he's asking, is any insights into how these will be modulated when made into these different parts of extended polymers?
Okay, so that would be, I mean, actually making a polymer that contains the different parts. If I understand the question correctly. So here, of course, the emphasis so far has been essentially on molecular materials, and not really on polymers, because also, I mean, if you work with polymers, of course, then that's only the solution processing that can be applied. So there is additional complexity if you have those different types of functionalities that are made part of a long chain, because they can talk to one another. But I've not seen, actually, I may be wrong, of course, but I've not seen developments of such polymers having the different components that we discussed, like in a hyperfluorescent matrix.
Okay, so I think given this time limits, let's stop here, and also thank our speakers today, Professor Zhenan Bao, Professor Wolfgang Zeyer, and Professor Jean-Louis Brides. So thank you all, and also thank you all for coming and joining our global series. So we're looking forward to having you back in new 2021.